Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of March 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll recap President Trump's address to Congress. We'll hear more about the testimony from several sanctuary city mayors before Congress, and we'll discuss the latest on Trump's tariffs. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on President Trump's address to Congress, it's Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump delivered the first address to Congress of his second term this week, touching on a large number of topics as the rapid pace of executive orders and other actions continue in his seventh week in office. One Democratic congressman was escorted out after disrupting the address and later censured, while most Democrats refused to stand or cheer regardless of the topic. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, as with most things Trump, it was a partisan speech that Republicans celebrated and Democrats decried. What are your top takeaways?
This is a big win for Trump. He was able to tout a lot of his agenda. It showed that the Republican Party is very unified behind him. There's no doubt about that. They cheered for him. You know, there's a time not long ago when Republicans were split over Trump, and some, you know, in his first term, there were several who wanted to be never Trumpers and kind of have this resistance within the Republican Party. There is none of that this time around. I mean, all but one of his Republicans in the House voted for Trump's tax cuts, which are going to, you know, raise the debt by several trillion, and not much was even said against it. I mean, there was a CBS News YouGov poll. They found 76% of those who watched the speech approved of it. 63% said he spent a lot of time on the issues they care about. Of course, Republicans liked it a lot more than Democrats. 68% said the speech made them feel hopeful. 54% said it made them feel proud, and then much smaller percentages had negative, you know, emotions when watching the speech. So overall, big win. It showed unity. He was able to tout his work on the border, what he's done with spending cuts. He had a long riff where he listed off a lot of ridiculous spending items that DOJ has been cutting, and a lot of people laughed. I think that, you know, there were some Democratic protests and things, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And I think he handled it very well. He handled it with grace. It was an opportunity for Trump to take the bait and kind of become irate and start scolding them. But he showed restraint, and it made him look presidential, and it made the Democrats look petulant.
On DOJ, the new Department of Government Efficiency that Elon Musk has oversight to, you know, Democrats have been criticizing these DOJ cuts essentially from day one. But it's popular with Americans when they hear about some of this, how their taxpayer dollars are being spent. There's some outrage there.
There certainly is. And, you know, Americans do just have, and long before Trump, believe that the government is wasteful and that the cuts can be made. And I think some of these examples, you know, it's kind of amazing that Trump felt Ronald Reagan-esque in these moments, even though in many ways he's so different from Reagan. But he was up there making jokes about government waste in these reports. And I kept thinking, I'm watching Ronald Reagan right now. And he even had some very funny moments, like that were Reagan-esque too, like when he said, that, you know, some Americans on Social Security are living according to the federal records, are 150, 200, even 300 years old, which of course is impossible. And he said, I guess, we're a healthier country than I thought, Bobby. We're speaking to Bobby Kennedy, who's in charge of, you know, Health and Human Services. And, it was just a great joke. It felt like a Reagan-esque line. And I think that combining these really aggressive policies with a little bit more of this humor and this softness from Trump is actually a very deadly combination for Republicans. It really showed. There is some polling that shows that Americans are worried about moving too quickly with DOGE and maybe, using too much of a chainsaw and less of a scalpel. And I think you saw that reflected this week when Trump said publicly that he wants people to use a scalpel, despite Elon Musk coming out with a chainsaw at CPAC. Some kind of different messages. Musk has the chainsaw. Trump is saying the scalpel. He wants to use a scalpel, and he wants the heads of agencies to do the cutting and to not cut good people, whatever that means. I mean, of course you don't want to cut good people, but if you're firing, thousands of workers when you've only been at the agency for a few weeks, how do you really know who all the good people are? It's pretty tough to know, I think. So I think you're seeing some mixed messaging here, maybe a different approach from Musk or Trump, or maybe they both want the chainsaw, but Trump is just saying what, trying to seem a little more wise, a little more presidential, and use this scalpel language to put people's fears at ease.
Another issue President Trump touched on that is also widely popular with Americans is banning biological males from female sports. It's another issue that Democrats are in the vast minority on.
Well, what happened really, it used to be like a 50-50, more of a 50-50 issue, or 55-45. And just over the course of the last few years, it's just totally swung against Democrats. I think there was a major documentary from the Daily Wire called What is a Woman? And I think that really is a big part of what's, pivoted the whole nation. And then once Democrats lost in 2024, when Republicans ran so hard against transgenderism, they ran ads against it in swing states. They ran very hard against it. And then once Republicans won, that kind of changed the national idea of what is the general consensus. And I think that matters very much to Americans. What is the general consensus? Because we are very democratically minded. And so once it became seen that, this is what the majority of Americans thinks. And by the way, states are starting to ban it. There's more and more detransitioners coming out saying how horrific what happened to them was. And, even some doctors raising concerns. So all that is flipped this issue. It's a winning issue for Republicans, so they're going to keep bringing it up, keep hammering it. I think a lot of it too is this issue has changed because young women have stood up. When it was just older white men talking about this issue, it didn't resonate. But when young women who had trophies taken from them started to speak out, I think that was a pivotal point. Republicans have captured it, and now they're just riding this political wave as long as they can.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on a congressional hearing examining mayors from sanctuary cities across the country, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
4 sanctuary city mayors who spent millions of state and federal taxpayer dollars to accommodate illegal immigrants testified before a U.S. House committee this week. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Therese Boudreau. Therese, set the scene for us. Who was involved in this hearing?
So you had Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, you had Denver Mayor Mike Johnston, and then New York City Mayor Eric Adams. And all of those mayors, their cities were sanctuary cities. So they spent a lot of taxpayer dollars to accommodate immigrants who came across the border illegally and then were granted parole under Biden administration policies. And so Republicans from the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee called them there to basically explain themselves.
So obviously a lot was said on both sides in this hearing. Take us through the exchanges kind of one by one. Let's start with Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson.
Yeah, so Brandon Johnson, when he was there, he basically accused lawmakers of scapegoating immigrants, because one of the arguments that a lot of Republicans make is that when you have a huge, flux of thousands and thousands of migrants come to a city, you usually see increased crime, increased strain on city resources. And also because as these migrants were coming in, most of them were pretty much unvetted. So you did see some Venezuelan gang members come in, and then it was just a really big strain on the city. But Johnson was saying actually that the policies he had, and that a lot of sanctuary cities also had, where they essentially refused to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. He even had a rule that said that local police officers couldn't contact ICE and let ICE know that, we just arrested this illegal immigrant for committing a crime. And so he got a lot of pushback on that. But he was saying, no, his policies actually made the streets safer, essentially, because, he argues, illegal immigrants who have not committed crimes and who are maybe witnesses of or victims of crimes, if they were afraid that if they went to the police would tell ICE and they would be deported, then they wouldn't go to the police. So he was saying our streets are actually safer because the people who came in that were housing, they feel safe enough to report other crimes to the police. And that was also an argument that some other mayors made as well.
And what about Denver Mayor Mike Johnston? What was some of the highlights of his testimony?
So Johnston, again, similar policies. In fact, he also had a policy that he signed that said if you're any kind, not just local law enforcement, but any kind of state employee, you will be fired if you let ICE know that there is an illegal immigrant who committed a crime in the city, unless there's some special warrant that ICE has. But he also had a policy that made it harder for police to let ICE know so they could issue a warrant. But during the hearing, he tried pointing to decreasing crime numbers in 23 through 24, saying, look, we had a lot of immigrants come in, like 42,000, and crime has decreased. But what lawmakers pointed out was that crime in the neighboring city of Aurora, where the mayor shipped a lot of these migrants who came into Denver first, crime skyrocketed there. So lawmakers are kind of pushing back on his claim that having all of these immigrants come actually dampened crime numbers. They were saying, well, that, you just sent them to a different city and we saw bad things happening there. But he tried to make that argument.
And what about Boston Mayor Michelle Wu?
She was also very adamant that the conversations the Republicans having surrounding illegal immigrants were harmful as well. She even in her speech addressed the immigrants, who came illegally living in her city and saying, this is your home. You should stay here. You make the culture better. And she also said, she was telling lawmakers, you can't get on us because we're not deporting, these immigrants. That's the federal government's job. And then, it was Representative Michael Cloud. He was saying, we're not asking you to, round up and deport these people. We're just asking you to cooperate with ICE. So there was back and forth on that, where Wu was saying these people are actually, enhancing our city culture, our economy, and look how great Boston is doing. She pointed to the decreased crime rates in Boston as well, and how the city seems to be doing pretty well. So she very much defended her sanctuary city policies.
And the final witness was New York Mayor Eric Adams. What did he have to say?
So he was in an interesting position. Adams, of course, had his sanctuary city, where it was kind of, some policies where law enforcement were told that they, again, shouldn't let ICE know, if illegal immigrants had committed crimes, they shouldn't hand them over to ICE. But he recently shut down the migrant shelters in his city and kind of pivoted from blaming the problem on Republicans, and has said that he will cooperate with President Trump's recent illegal immigration crackdowns. And so he actually, even though he for a long time had sanctuary city and defended that, a lot of Democratic lawmakers were very antagonistic towards him, saying, "Oh, you're just colluding with Trump now, and you've turned your back on immigrants and things like that." So he was in a very interesting position, because he did defend his policies in the hearing. He said, "Look, we were just dealing with this crisis that was forced upon us." Now, of course, he said his city was welcoming, so you could say, well, it wasn't quite forced upon you. But he was saying we had this big flux of immigrants, so we did what we could. But then he received backlash for, now working with the Trump administration, it seems, or cooperating, I should say, with ICE. So he was a bit different in that regard, but all of the mayors, they definitely were making arguments that we shouldn't be here. You know, you shouldn't be, telling us that we've done something wrong, because all of them said we didn't do anything wrong. We just did the best we could. Or again, in the case of Wu and Johnston, they were saying we actually did the best thing that we could. This actually has helped our city. So yeah, there were some Republican lawmakers who, were hinting, oh, we should press charges against you guys. So, it's not clear whether that will happen or not. It seemed to just be more of it was a very long hearing. It seemed to be just more of a, people airing their views and their grievances and accusations, and the mayor's trying to explain. So it was a very, very heated, hearing. So we'll see what happens next. There might not necessarily be any action, taken from Congress. But all the mayors did ask Congress to pass, immigration reform, to comprehensive immigration reform, so that, they don't have to do this again, essentially. So we'll see where that goes.
Well, Therese, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Therese. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug, back with more on Trump's tariffs. It's Dan McCaleb.
It's been another whirlwind week when it comes to President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods imported into the U.S. The 25% tariffs went into effect Tuesday, sending stocks lower. Then on Thursday, Trump paused many of the tariffs for another 30 days. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, there's uncertainty in the markets and the economy surrounding Trump's tariffs plans. Tell us more.
I think there's uncertainty in Congress about what Trump's going to do. There's probably uncertainty even within the White House about what Trump's going to do on this issue, because he has, changed course so many times. He announces a tariff, he changes it. And, I think in some ways this really, whether you like it or not, this sort of is part of his strategy. Trump loves he thrives in the chaos. He's able to navigate these choppy waters when others sink. And I think that's how he won his elections. He created, chaos, and then he rode the wave as well. And so it seems like that's how he's handling his negotiations with these world leaders. So there's a lot of different things here. I mean, the latest news about the tariffs being rescinded. Of course, there are tariffs in China that are staying in place. And that's been, since 2016, 2015, Trump has campaigned on cracking down on China. I think there's general support for that. It is understood that China takes advantage of the U.S. in different ways, with their currency and different things. Economically, Chinese companies have done different things to skirt American taxes for a while. And so Trump is closing those loopholes. But when it comes to, the Western hemisphere and Trump putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it's a whole different ballgame. For one, we get a lot of energy from Canada. And so if we really do keep these tariffs on Canada, it's probably going to raise energy prices. Now, Trump has said that he's going to open up domestic drilling in the U.S., but, that takes time to hit into the markets. I mean, it's not like you drill for a barrel of oil on Friday and that's what's in your gasoline tank on Monday. It's a long process, and it takes time for those prices to reflect. And so there could be a rise in energy prices from Canada. And of course, we import a lot from Mexico, different things from Mexico as well. So right now, I think he's trying to play fast and loose with this. He's trying to be nimble, but it is, as you said, creating a lot of uncertainty. Markets love certainty, and they're not getting it right now from Trump.
So, and Trump also said this week that he plans to announce what's called reciprocal tariffs against other countries, European countries, Asian countries, etc., that already impose tariffs on U.S. goods. Now, that seems reasonable to me. If let's just say France is putting a tariff on American goods, then why wouldn't the U.S. have the same amount of tariffs on French goods?
Yes, I think you're right about that. I think that the Canada and Mexico tariffs are maybe where Trump is in danger of going off track on his tariffs message, because the heart of his tariff message is that he wants basically economic justice in the world. I mean, that's really what he's saying, is there's a fairness problem. And so when he slaps the tariffs on China, most Americans don't blink an eye. They say, great. Even if Democrats say, well, this is going to make your, the cheap toys at Walmart going to cost 10% more. I don't think that's going to resonate as a criticism. And people want, they're open to some kind of fairness. There is this general sense that the U.S. is being taken advantage of around the world. That's why you saw such strong support for Trump cutting U.S. aid. It feels like a different issue, but really it's the same issue, which is this feeling among Americans that Trump has stoked, but was already there. He's been there for a while, that the world takes advantage of America, that, we protect all these countries with far-flung places. And sometimes, like, Ukraine, it feels like they're not grateful, or NATO, they don't pay their fair share of the defense agreements that they agreed to. And we're, we're paying for, basically practically like yoga lessons in the Sahara Desert or something, ridiculous, for the rest of the world. And so Trump is combating that. So reciprocal tariffs resonate on that same America First line. As you said, that we want fairness. But when it comes to punishing Canada and Mexico, I think he's going to the second half of his tariffs argument, which is tariffs can raise a lot of money. That's what Trump says. He says they can make the U.S. rich. I think the jury's out on that one. That's a harder argument to make, whether it's going to be worth it, whether it really can raise this money. A lot of economists are skeptical. The U.S. has not wielded tariffs in over 100 years in this way. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions.
The other part of it that I don't think gets enough attention is Trump's use of these tariffs, or these threats of tariffs, as a negotiating tactic to get other things. You mentioned other countries have taken advantage of the U.S. because of its economic power, because of its military power for decades. And Trump wants to equal the playing field here. And how much of these tariffs, these threats of tariffs, are him just as a negotiation tactic? For example, Canada and Mexico. Trump said he was going to issue put these tariffs in place to stop the flow of human trafficking and drug trafficking at the northern and the southern borders. How key to that is all this?
I think it's what he's trying to do, and he has gotten some concessions. We've seen what reference with Mexico, Canada said. Even with now apparently Europe is going to be paying for hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine's defense now, which is kind of incredible, because we've been footing most of, so much of that bill, and now they're upping their commitment. And really it is, we care, but Ukraine's on their doorstep. If anybody's next, it's these European countries, not us. And so we have an interest, we care and all that. But, you're seeing these other countries pairing. I think it's also about respect. It's not just about negotiating. It can be a negotiation tactic. And the smaller, the weaker the economy, the more power we have, of course, to threaten them. And we can get some things out of that. But I think Trump also wants us to be respected again. And that's what he's pushing. He wants to put a little bit of fear of the U.S. and these other countries. So on the trafficking thing, Canada and Mexico have pledged different things. I think Trump feels like it hasn't been enough. So maybe this time around he'll be able to really get some concrete concessions, but only really in the way things are run now, only Trump can decide when these countries have done enough to satisfy him to lift these tariffs.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How is Washington State spending the revenue from its cap and trade program? What kind of education secretary will newly confirmed Linda McMahon be? And is the housing market becoming a buyer's market? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits. Some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Aviation industry leaders say America's air traffic control systems are outdated, understaffed, and underfunded, risking more deadly plane accidents in the near future if things do not change. In light of the Trump administration laying off hundreds of Federal Aviation Administration employees and a recent string of deadly plane accidents, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation heard from aviation industry and labor representatives on Tuesday. The witnesses asked Congress to allocate more money to the aviation industry, revealing that the FAA is having trouble modernizing aviation infrastructure and safety systems, many of which still use floppy disks because it receives no steady stream of funding. Women's sports advocates suffered a loss this week when all Democratic U.S. senators present voted against the bill that would have banned males who identify as transgender from competing against women in sports. Republicans were unable to garner the 7 Democratic votes needed to advance the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act of 2025 to a vote on final passage. Democrats argued the bill is an attack on transgender people, while Republicans labeled opponents as anti-women and out of touch with most Americans. The legislation would have effectively codified President Donald Trump's February 5th executive order, which reversed a Biden-era policy expanding Title IX to include gender identity. Trump's order also banned transgender athletes from participating in women's sports at schools and colleges. A petition is underway for recalling Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass over her wildfire response. Petitioners would need to collect a minimum of about 330,000 signatures to force a recall, during which voters would also be able to select their choice of replacement mayor to serve the rest of the term. Bass was criticized for leaving for Africa despite receiving advance warning of dangerous fire risks amid devastating wind gusts and low humidity after a period of little to no rain. Bass ordered an investigation into why she was allowed to leave for Ghana as part of a Biden administration delegation to the nation's presidential inauguration. The mayor later said former Los Angeles Fire Chief Kristen Crowley downplayed risks. The mayor fired Crowley in February. A Senate committee in Georgia could investigate organizations with ties to former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. Georgia State Senator Bill Cowsert filed a resolution that would authorize the Senate Special Committee on Investigations to look into NGOs named the New Georgia Project and Power Forward Communities. The State Ethics Commission levied a $300,000 fine against the New Georgia Project in January after finding it failed to disclose it gave money to canvassers to support Abrams' 2018 run. Lee Zeldin, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, said Power Forward Communities, another organization with ties to Abrams, received a $2 billion grant under the $891 billion Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Legalization criminalizing Senate bill criminalizing public officials lying about their military service and awards has advanced out of 2 committees in the Florida Senate. Senate Bill 348 would add to the state's code of ethics a prohibition on candidates, elected public officers, appointed public officers, and public employees for making false claims related to their military service for material gain. Penalties for violation could include censure by the Florida Board of Ethics, a fine of $25,000, and a recommendation of removal from office by the governor. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on Washington State's use of the funds from its Carbon Commitment Act, it's our Eliana Cardodal.
The Washington State Department of Ecology released a report outlining how funds from the Cap and Trade program created by the Climate Commitment Act were spent in fiscal year 2024. Here with more on this is the Center Square's Washington reporter, TJ Martinell. TJ, the Center Square has been following the Climate Commitment Act since it passed in 2021. Can you give us the background?
Yeah, so the Climate Commitment Act creates a cap and trade program, and what it does is it sets a maximum threshold for carbon emissions, and emitters who go above it have to participate in a carbon auction where they buy carbon credits. And obviously the price goes up or down based on how much is needed. And then that money from the auction proceeds goes into several accounts that the state accounts, and the legislature gets to decide how to appropriate those funds for projects related to environmental benefits.
What did the Department of Ecology's recent report have to say about how funds from this program are being spent?
Well, they said there's what they said, and then there's the data that's actually in there. And so what they said is that in the fiscal year 2024, $472 million was spent on projects. And I believe, the auctions generated 1.3 billion. And so what was interesting is where the money went. And according to the data provided, out of that 472 million, 53 million, or 11% of that spending was spent on projects that had some form of carbon reduction. So the whole idea for the Climate Commitment Act was to reduce carbon emissions in the state. And so for the projects that's being funded through it, only 11% were spent on carbon reduction.
So what kind of impact did that have on Washington's total carbon emissions or projected carbon emissions?
So the amount of carbon reduced, and this is over time, so this is not immediate impact, is 335,000 metric tons, which is, according to the latest figures we have from Ecology, as far as total state emissions are concerned, that's about 0.3% of a percent. So 0.3% of annual emissions was reduced.
And what kinds of projects did it go to that didn't address emissions?
A lot of them had to do with the fact that there's a clause in the Climate Commitment Act that requires that about 35%, though the goal is 40%, is spent on overburdened communities and areas where there's health disparities. And I believe it was over 60% of funds was spent on those types of projects. And, some of them have to do with improving air quality, reducing air pollution and stuff like that. Though, according to what I read in the report, there's no tracking of the actual impacts to air quality. So I'm not sure if there's any way of them knowing whether or not the project actually has any benefits in that regard. The other types of projects that they do has to do with, say, public transit, bike lanes, EV charging stations. So things like that.
And does the Climate Commitment Act specify at all how much of the funds have to go to reducing carbon emissions? You mentioned that there is a specific clause saying how much have to go to these specific projects for certain communities. Are there any other guidelines on how it has to be spent?
No, that's an interesting omission from the state law. There's no requirement. There is a requirement that a certain amount of the revenue goes in. There's a specific state account where the money is to be used for carbon emission reduction, but there's no requirement that a minimum amount of the money spent goes towards reducing carbon. So there's the same spending mandate that we have for, overburdened communities is not there for carbon reduction.
And you reached out to the Department of Ecology asking about this spending. What did they have to say?
They noted that the ecology has no control over how the money is spent. The appropriations are all done by the legislature. So if people have questions about the spending priorities, the buck doesn't stop with ecology. It stops with the state legislature. So for people who are looking at this and wondering why there's not more spending on carbon reduction, they should reach out to their local representatives and senators and not complain or ask ecology about it.
Well, TJ, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Linda McMahon's confirmation as Education Secretary, let's go back to Eliana Kernodle.
The U.S. Senate confirmed President Donald Trump's pick for Secretary of Education, even as the department's future remains uncertain. Joining me to dig into this is reporter for the Center Square, Therese Boudreau. Therese, Linda McMahon is an interesting choice for Secretary of Education. What is her background?
So in terms of her education and political background, she's a longtime school choice advocate. She led the Small Business Administration under Trump's first term. Other than that, I mean, she was appointed to Connecticut's State Board of Education in 2009, and she served there for about 15 months. And then she served as the Board of Trustees at Sacred Heart University. But other than that, she hasn't really had that much experience in education. But she's definitely a longtime advocate of different education policies.
And what have some lawmakers said about McMahon's confirmation?
Well, Republican lawmakers, they've really praised her for her stances on school choice. Again, she's very outspoken about that. So they all, in the Senate confirmation vote, all Republicans voted for her. But Democrats, all of them, they seemed united against her because her support for things like charter schools, which a lot of Democrats say take money from quote unquote normal public schools. So they say, oh, she's anti-public school system, and this is going to hurt teachers and public education. So all of the senators present voted against her. So it was kind of a close vote. But she was not the most controversial pick by far, but she has received pushback from Democrats.
And the Trump administration continues to float the idea of dismantling the Department of Education. How has McMahon responded to the idea of leading a department apparently set for the chopping block?
So she actually is very supportive. Just in the past couple of days, actually sent out a memo that is kind of planning for the demolishment of the education department. Just saying she says it's failed school systems, and that it's time for it to go, essentially. So she seems to be seeing her role as the leader of the department as kind of leading it to its end, to kind of streamlining that process and supporting that process to end it, so that education, they say, will go back to the more state and local level. So she definitely doesn't expect it to continue. Now, there's a lot of conversation about how the Trump administration would end the Department of Education, whether he could do that by a simple executive order or whether Congress would need to help with that, which is very unlikely that would be the case. But so far she's planning and supportive of the idea to demolish the department, and her role right now just seems to be coordinating that, essentially.
As you mentioned, abolishing the Department of Education is a pretty big contentious topic, and you can really get into the policy weeds on it about what it would look like and if it's possible. But you've followed that conversation a little bit in Congress and just on the national stage. What has been some of the back and forth there?
So again, there's Republicans on one side saying that the Department of Education doesn't do so much to where abolishing it would really cause any harm, and in fact has caused harm. So their argument, the Department of Education, it does some things where it funds about 10% of the public school system. It funds different programs for disabled children and children from impoverished backgrounds, and then it administers Pell Grants, different government scholarships, and also the FAFSA, the student loan programs. And it does a couple of other things too. And then also it sort of sets the curriculum agenda, for lack of a better term. And that specifically is what a lot of Republicans and school choice advocates are against. During the COVID years, as parents became, as the school shut down and reopened, and parents kind of saw more of the curriculum that their kids were getting, and saw how there were these kind of gender or sexuality or race focused classroom initiatives and teaching. And as we saw, a lot of parents went to school boards and they complained about that. And Republicans, of course, so they've really been crusading for the end of that. And it looks like they see that just demolishing the Department of Education would be the most straightforward way of doing that, of taking the what they say are the woke policies out of education. And then Democrats, for their part, are saying, like, you can't just demolish this entire department. That's going to have huge ramifications. Even just with FAFSA and with coordinating that and the strain that it would put, they say, on states and local schools. So there's a lot of different, arguments and a lot of different points being bantered about. So it's, in any case, it would not be a, smooth process. It would not be, conventional. So it'd be quite an adjustment, if that does happen. But so there are very, very intense arguments happening on either side, whether it's a positive good or whether it's actually a bad thing that the Department of Education exists.
Well, Therese, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Therese. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss shifts in the housing markets. PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. I want to talk to you about where we are in the housing market at this point. You know, we're past the Super Bowl. In theory, we're like the checkered flag has been waved. And we're sort of on our way, toward the heat of, what's typically the high tide of the sales season. And there's a softness present here.
Yes. And it's interesting because I have been very optimistic.
I know.
Very optimistic. And let me just kind of reiterate my optimism. The reason I've been optimistic is because mortgage rates essentially were on the rise in November and December.
Yes, they were.
And they ended up peaking on January 10th. Since then, they've come down. And so all of the data that we got for contracts signed in December, contracts signed in January, for me at least, were expected to show a slowdown. And then if you add to that the January winter freeze that delayed home touring, search activity, home tours, delayed closings and all that, you can expect an even more negative pressure on total home sales and transactions.
Can I tell you what I'm seeing as a lay person? Someone that might buy a house and doesn't have to worry about talking about the industry, writ large. I'm seeing interest rates, that are actually starting to look pretty good. Freddie Mac has it at 6.76% on a conventional 30-year. Now that's a national average. That's blended and might be, in this market might be higher.
Credit.
Yeah.
And low debt to income.
Right.
You're even lower than that.
You're going to get lower. And I also see like now for the first time in a while that a 15-year mortgage, if you can make that happen, it's below 6. So like that objection is starting to lessen, like the buyer objection. Home prices, I get reports. I've been a homeowner, in my present home for, over 20 years. And, of course I live in Illinois. So every realtor within 10 miles of me, contacts me and asks me, when I'm leaving, because they just presume that I will be leaving soon. And I'm starting to see like an absolute softening in the expectation around price on my home. Last summer, I want to say that it kind of peaked. I'm looking at maybe now in the reports that I'm getting maybe 10% less on a projection basis if I were to list my home. I'm not listing my home this year, but if I were, I'd be looking at about 10% less. So question, is this becoming a buyer's market? And we haven't just seen that yet.
Absolutely spot on. Okay. The pendulum has shifted. And by the way, you can check this out.
In select markets though, I mean, not everywhere.
Not everywhere. Zillow has a, really cool gadget. My favorite gadget anyway. It's called the Zillow Market Heat Index.
Uh-huh.
And, you can find it on Zillow.com/research where you have data, dashboards, market reports, and the Market Heat Index shows you basically, how things are shifting in favor of buyers. Anyway.
Well, bring it home for me. One last thought. Cause it's just like we're kind of pushing up.
The thing is, you get a report this week that shows pending home sales in January were down 4.6%.
Yep.
And
year over year.
No, on the month.
On the monthly basis.
6% on the month. Massive drop, right?
Right. Well,
and so like, when I see that, well, should I think it's demand is coming down and buyers are not coming back? Or should I think actually interest rates are higher? They only started slowing midway through the month. And at the same time, well, in January, we had the winter freeze and we also had the wildfires. So to me, that number.
It's really hard to sell a house that's been burned to the ground.
Yeah. And I feel bad for these people. That number.
And I'm not being funny at anyone's expense, but I'm just being literal.
And really the drop in January, I start to see and feel like people, even experts, are starting to worry about this. And I'm sitting there like, guys, you might want to wait a little bit to see what happens in a month where you don't have so much noise in the data and where you can actually make sense of it. And here's my take on this. And we're going to see who's right on this, by the way. That's what I love about this podcast, because you can't hide. You make a forecast, you can't hide from it. My take is buyers are coming back with interest rates coming down and more options available to them on the housing market. You should see transactions show an uptick in the spring.
Okay.
Maybe we're going to get it delayed a little bit because we had a rougher winter, right? Though I do add one caveat though. The labor market has to hold up. We start talking on one of our shows about the fact that the labor market was frozen in place and that we were starting to see an uptake in initial claims and continued claims and then a sharp initial claims uptake because of federal government workers getting laid off. And so as long as the labor market holds up, we'll be fine. If the labor market doesn't hold up, that's when I start to worry. And so when people come up to me with these, oh, what do you see? Variations across markets. Should we be worried? I say, look at the labor market. Look at the labor market. Pay attention to what's happening in the labor market, and it will tell you everything you need to know about the housing market. Because you know what? Unemployed people can't get a mortgage.
That's right.
Okay. But ultimately people move. They move because they find new jobs. And so if you have a strong labor market, you have a strong housing market. You have more transactions. They move because their life happens. They get married. They have a baby. Right. And so I say, look at the labor market. If the labor market holds up, housing will be just fine. Where the labor market goes, so does the housing market.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed today's show, you can find it wherever you find great podcasts. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.